Welcome to the Ada Lovelace Day podcast. I'm Sue Charman-Anderson, and this month we're talking about life as a tech reporter for the BBC with Zoe Kleinman. And Dr. Paul Coxon from the University of Cambridge will tell us about the fascinating work of metallurgist Constance Tipper.
So this month I'm talking to Zoe Kleinman, who is a tech reporter at the BBC. Hi, Zoe.
Hello.
So tech reporter at the BBC, I think for a lot of people that's probably a dream job. Was that your dream?
It has become a dream job. I mean, I have to say, I'm pretty lucky. There's a very small team of us here. There's only a few of us. And we cover a tech remit for a very general audience. You know, the BBC has to appeal to everybody. So we have to talk to people who know and understand a lot about tech, and equally those who know nothing about tech. But, you know, increasingly it's something that impacts on our everyday lives. And so it's an important story that we have to tell. I've always loved gadgets. So getting to sort of hang out with people who make them and try them out is a delight. I won't lie, and you know, I'm obviously very committed to my duty, and it's a pleasure to do that on behalf of people who are interested.
So how did you become a tech reporter? Did you start off with an interest in tech, or was it sort of the journalism where you started, or a mix of both?
So I think for me, I've done different forms of journalism and storytelling in the past. Storytelling really is the thing that I have always loved, you know, since I was small. I just like being able to tell people interesting things. And I think, you know, there's just so much around us in the world that is worth taking a bit of time to learn about. I don't have a tech background, but I was very interested in it quite early on. And I came to the BBC in 2001 on a 12-month contract, and I've sort of never left. It's the longest year of my entire life. But I ended up doing various sort of jobs around this place. And then I worked for a bit on the staff paper. We used to have an internal newspaper called Ariel, and I worked on that. And one of the things I realised that we just weren't doing was telling the story of, you know, how we broadcast and what the future of broadcasting is. And I discovered that we don't have it anymore, I don't think, but we had this amazing research venue called Kingswood Warren, which was this like Hogwarts type place, like a castle somewhere in deepest, darkest Surrey. And the people that were working there were these phenomenal R&D guys, really. They were mostly guys, I think that's fair to say. And they had been working on the future of broadcasting they were light years ahead of us. You know, I remember meeting them in probably about 2005 maybe. And they'd been working on HD for like 25 years. Nobody'd heard of HD. You know, now, what isn't in HD? God, even I'm in HD half the time, which I hate, but, you know, thanks for that, guys. You know, they were just so far ahead, and every time I went down there, they'd show me stuff like 8K televisions, you know, which were just seemed so incredibly super real at the time. And I remember sitting in a room and having this sort of audio experience where the audio was kind of like a 360 audio that they'd been working. I mean, totally useless, you know, no, it certainly wouldn't even fit in my lounge, let alone would I be able to watch a film in it, but just fascinating. And so I started telling those sorts of stories and got more and more interested in the tech. And then I applied for a job working on a TV show called Working Lunch, which we used to do, which was a business show. And I was going to run their website. And I'd been there for about 2 weeks. And the editor said to me, Zoe, do you know anything about blogging? And I went, oh, yeah, I know loads about blogging. And they said, okay, well, we want to do a piece on it. And I went, oh, that's a great idea. Yeah. And they said, well, would you do it? And I said, oh, God, no. I've never done any TV. I don't know how to make television. I don't want to be on the telly. It's scary. And they said, oh, no, we'll just have a go. And I was absolutely petrified. I remember coming home and like talking to my partner and just saying, I just don't want to do this. I'm terrified of being on the telly. In my head, you know, if you were on the telly, you were like doing Strictly Come Dancing, and I certainly wasn't that. And I was so frightened. And he was like, you've got to do it. You know, it's a great opportunity, and you've always loved talking, which you can probably tell I do. And so I ended up doing a compromise with them where I said, well, I won't go on screen, but I'll voice it. I'll read a script. And they said, okay, go and write a script. So I wrote this script. It was about 800 words, which I thought was perfectly reasonable. And I took it back to them and they said, no, you've got about 120. And I went, I can't tell a story in 120 words. You might have noticed I still can't really tell a story in 120 words. But somehow we sort of chopped it down and it went out, and it was amazing. I just thought, okay, well, it didn't kill me. Nobody emailed in and said they hated my voice and who the hell was this person, and maybe I could do it more. And that actually, Sue, that is how I met you, isn't it? Yeah. Because I did a piece on weddings.
Yes.
And we got in touch and you gave me loads of top tips about how to save money when you're getting married, which I still think is one of the highlights of my career, actually.
That's my alter ego, the wedding money saving expert. But science communication has become incredibly important, and there's an awful lot of conversation about how we communicate science to people who aren't in science. Do you think there's been an evolution in the way we communicate tech to people who aren't in tech?
Well, I think as tech has become more ingrained in life, it's become kind of easier, but also taken for granted. So, there was a time when somebody setting up a website and selling a pizza through the website would be a tech story because, wow, they use the internet to sell a pizza. Now, if it was indeed going to be a story, it would be, what was on the pizza, or who bought the pizza, or, who was the person who made the pizza. The website aspect of it has become completely irrelevant, as it should. So like here, the WikiLeaks stories tend to be covered by the politics reporters or the world reporters because the fact that they were released on the web doesn't make them a tech story. Whereas there is a time when that would have fallen to me because of the method of communication. So I kind of think it's got easier because people are more accepting of it. The fact that you sent somebody an email is no longer extraordinary, and rightly so. I also think people understand a lot less about the devices that they have and what they actually do. I think, what we see is people happily downloading apps, installing digital assistants in their homes, being very happy to talk to them and get them to, tell them jokes or whatever, but they don't really understand how they work and what they're doing. And we're kind of losing that connection with tech, perhaps.
Do you think the ubiquity is kind of making everything mundane, and we need to be paying a bit more attention to what the technology is actually doing?
Possibly. I mean, in a way, it's become part of everyday life. I don't know about you. I have very rarely thought about how the kettle works or, what the iron does. I don't even know where my iron is. But, the point is that we shouldn't obsess about everything that we have. We're very lucky to have it. We should appreciate it, and that's the end of it. But also, we should kind of respect it more, I think. And, there are lots of companies making an awful lot of money out of us. And I don't think many people really understand how they're doing it. But free services, such as, the big social media platforms, dating platforms, anything that you're using for free, you're giving something. And I think there could possibly be more awareness about that. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but, it should be a more informed process that you're choosing to give.
So in terms of, like you say, you don't come from a tech background, but ever since I've known you, you've been kind of knowledgeable about technology and gadgets and actually, I hate the word gadget because it's very sort of trivializing what actually, I mean, as you say, a phone is no longer a gadget. Alexa, Amazon Echo is not really a gadget, but we still have this way of sort of framing technology in silos, and gadgets would be one. You've always been, I thought, incredibly knowledgeable about all of these things. I mean, I find it hard sometimes to keep up because the pace of change is dizzying. So how do you stay on top of it all?
Well, I mean, it's my job. It's my world. I read a lot. I talk to a lot of people. I'm very lucky that I have some incredibly intelligent, wonderful experts who are far cleverer than I am, who are able to explain and communicate and analyse and inform the way in which we are able to then report stuff. I think, it's astonishing to see. You only have to look at the rise of AI. I feel like in the last, the experts will say, well, it's been around for 20 years, and it has. But in the last year or so, it's taken off hugely, and it's enjoying this sort of exponential growth, and suddenly everything is becoming AI powered. And it's very hard to keep up with that because it is changing so quickly. You're right, it is. But also, like I said, we are talking to a mainstream audience. So I have to think, would my mum understand this? Would I be able to sit and talk to my grandma about this or not? And if the answer is no, that doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't do it. I always try to bring something into it that anyone can get a sense of, even if you come away thinking, I'm not sure I'm going to be an expert on machine learning any day soon,
So given that tech has evolved hugely and incredibly rapidly, how has that changed? Not necessarily about, the stories that you do, but the way that you cover stories. How has technology changed how you do your job?
Well, I mean, in terms of the equipment that we use, it's become a lot easier. I do a lot of broadcasting on the World Service. And basically now, I can interview anybody in the world as long as they've got a smartphone and they can record their end of the conversation into it and send it to me. The quality of the microphones that are in those devices is better than anything that we would be able to get remotely through a studio. So, that's a small example. And I regularly take video and pictures on my phone that I use for online. I don't carry a broadcast camera around with me. Oh, God, can you imagine? I'd be dead. The equipment that we use has got smaller and easier and made it much easier to get a wider variety of voices on air, certainly. Because, we're sitting here in a cosy studio in central London, which is lovely, but we're not London News, we're a global provider, so it's very important that we can get everywhere, and the spread of those sorts of devices have done that. I think that the topic of tech, has evolved, and my favourite stories are the human interest ones, so the ones where you can sort of pick almost like a case study. I mean, it's quite traditional journalism in a way, but when you can really apply tech to a person and how it's impacted on an ordinary life, and people are doing the most extraordinary things. I interviewed a lady, a wonderful lady actually, who lives up in Lancashire at the end of last year in the north of the UK. She got so annoyed about her broadband, her internet being totally rubbish, and that she decided to install her own. So she basically, it started when her neighbour, who was in a farm like 3 miles away, there was a row of trees between them, and as the trees grew, her neighbour was getting Wi-Fi from her, and then as the trees grew, the Wi-Fi couldn't get through anymore. So they bought, and this is the incredible power of the UK farming community, they bought 1 kilometre, I think, of fibre optic cable. They dug a trench with their tractors between their two farms and they lit it. And they had this little internet connection going. And this has become this huge project now. They've got like 2,000 customers or something, and they'll come to a village. The whole village has to agree to it. And they claim to have the most phenomenal upload and download speeds. And when I was there, I used it, and it was very, very fast. But what a great example. I wouldn't know where to start. I have cursed my internet connection, as I'm sure we all have, a million times. But I would not know how to start thinking, right, well, I'm just going to build my own. But people are out there doing this incredible stuff because the openness of it, I suppose. And I just think that's amazingly inspiring.
Do you find as well that because of things like social media and we have individually we have a broader reach than we've ever had before, we can find out more about what's going on around the world, has that allowed you to reach more unusual stories, more diverse voices? Has that helped?
Yeah, definitely. Social media is a huge, an amazing way of contacting people. I mean, it's got a dark side to it as well, which is really unfortunate. And I think, anyone who's been attacked on social media will have come out of it a bit bruised and bloodied, I suppose, because it's nasty. And that is horrific. And I think it's a problem that's not going away. And I think it's a problem that the platforms very much hope will just sort of disappear if nobody talks about it, but I don't think that is the case. But anyway, the good side of it is that people, you're much more visible, and if I write a story for the BBC News website, or I don't know, I'm on air doing a programme, I'll come off air and I'll have tweets from people, or I did a Facebook Live yesterday, and people were sending me emails to my Facebook page wanting to carry on the conversation, which is brilliant. I love that. People from all over the world, nobody I would ever cross paths with in any way. But, we were having this great conversation on Facebook Messenger, of all things, about the recent ransomware attack that's hit the world at the time of speaking. We'll probably have another one by the time this comes out. There's so many of them. But anyway, this huge thing. And that was just a wonderful, powerful thing. It's a way of connecting with your audience that we've never had before. And also, I think it makes you a better journalist, actually, because you're more accountable and they won't hesitate to go, you said this, that was nonsense, that you got that totally wrong. And you have to sort of be robust. I don't mind that. I'm happy to debate. What I hate is, the insults, calling somebody something, a nasty name or whatever. I get a bit of anti-Semitism from time to time, and that's always grim. And apparently, that it's not uncommon, unfortunately. But it's like, what does that achieve? I don't know what that achieves. That doesn't open up communication. Tell me you don't like my journalism. Tell me you want to debate something I've said. That's fine. But insults, what? Yeah. How does that open anything up,
And I've seen that firsthand, particularly after doing Newsnight. People feel very able to insult the way that you look and not even what you've said. Yeah. Is this one of the sort of biggest challenges that you face with your job?
I think being a woman probably doesn't help. I certainly get more abuse than my male colleagues do, I would say. Some of it, I think, is part of the course. I think, if you're in the public eye and you're saying stuff that you expect people to listen to, then you also have to not be horrified when they talk back. Everyone's an armchair critic. I've sat there watching telly thinking, oh, I don't like her coat, or oh, I wish she'd done her hair. We're human, right? We're human. But the difference is, and I don't know why this filter doesn't seem to be in place for some people, is you wouldn't actually say it. We all think unkind thoughts, I think, but we don't share them. We just sort of put them away in that, get back in the stupid, horrible box and listen to what that person's saying. I think being in the public eye is always going to get you a mixture of reviews. But yeah, I think it's worse for women, most definitely.
And how do you deal with that? Because I think it can be emotionally quite draining, particularly if there's quite a pile-on. So like I say, I did Newsnight, and you kind of walk out of that thinking, wow, I've done Newsnight, and it's terrifying, but I've done it, and that's great. And then you look at Twitter, and then you wish you hadn't. Emotionally, how do you get past that? Because you can't let it affect you. You've got to carry on.
Well, first of all, doing Newsnight is fantastic, and it's a top programme to be on. Don't let the haters take that away from you. I've never been on Newsnight. I'd love to go on Newsnight. I think, sometimes I just switch it off. I just don't look at it for a bit. I feel very torn about, the advice, which is block it and ignore it, because I sort of feel maybe I shouldn't feel this. I kind of feel like you have to see it. You have to know what people are saying. What if they suddenly start giving out your address to each other or something? You can't not be aware of that. You need to be safe, I guess. But no, it is horrible. I would have a glass of wine, quite a large one, complain to my friends about it and try and be robust. But, I have not had it in unmanageable levels. There are people that just get thousands and thousands. And I think, it's such a shame, because you sort of think, well, I'll just leave. Why am I here? I don't want to engage in this. I'll just leave. But then, of course, they win, don't they?
And I think as well, I'm seeing this in other STEM fields. There's more of a support network now with women helping other women who are dealing with challenges. And I think that didn't exist when I was younger. And I think, there is a network there, and it's friends and colleagues, but there's also kind of, random strangers on the internet who will be supportive just because they see you having a hard time. I don't think that really existed before, and I think it really helps.
And that, right, is the positive side of social media. All these people come together and are able to offer support and help in a way that we've never had before. The dark side is they can also come together and pile in on you, can't they? It's you're riding one wave or another. But I like to think that the good outweighs the bad. I think it does most of the time. I don't know what can be done about it, because it's that line, isn't it, between censorship and free speech, which is so important to all of us. Free speech, of course it is, but then in other ways, some of the anti-Semitic stuff that I've had, I'm like, I don't know how that is anything other than hate speech. For me, there's no grey area there. It's that's insults. There's not free speech. But what do I know?
So in terms of collaboration, you must end up working with a really broad swath of people. Obviously you've got your core team that you work with, but your whole job is essentially collaborating with people to tell a story, right?
Well, actually, being a reporter can be quite a lonely job, really, because you get your story, you research it, you talk to a lot of people who are connected with it, you get it together, you get the pictures, the video, whatever you're doing. TV is probably more collaborative because you have a producer and you'll be working with, a camera crew maybe, or increasingly not, you're filming it yourself. And you're obviously speaking to the people that are your contributors that are helping you put it together. But ultimately, you're kind of doing it all yourself. So it can be quite a lonely job. And I think sometimes some of the hardest jobs, I think, are being abroad, actually, because I've been lucky enough to go to CES, the massive tech fair in Las Vegas, in January every year. They're 8 hours. Vegas is 8 hours behind the UK. I've got small children, so I don't really get to talk to them because they're in bed by the time I'm able to speak to them. And or maybe I catch them and they're really tired, and so I don't have a very good conversation, or they cry or something, or they just don't want to talk to me. And then I have to carry that for until I next speak to them again, which might be in 3 days' time. And things like that I think are quite hard. At the end of a long day, sort of you come back and you file everything, and then you've got to get up at 5 a.m. to start again, and you just you can have these moments of thinking, I feel quite lonely now, actually. But having said that, you're working so hard that those moments don't last long before somebody gets in touch and says, I wondered if you could do something for us at midday. And you go, well, midday for you is 4 o'clock in the morning for me. And they go, that's all right, we'll phone you. And you're like, no, I'm not worried about who phones who. I'm more worried about the fact that it's 4 o'clock in the morning. So colleagues aren't always very sympathetic to the time difference.
So in terms of kind of like, the best parts of your job, what is it that really gets you excited and gets you up in the morning?
I just love telling stories, and it's such a varied job. I very rarely know from one day to the next what I'm going to be working on, because news is news. I didn't know that this ransomware thing was going to happen until it happened, and then it was a massive story. And there are so many different aspects to a story like that. Who's behind it? What can you do? People are worried. Should you just pay the ransom? It's amazing to sort of get all the pieces of a puzzle together with a big story. And sometimes, there's always something interesting going on. And because I work in a multimedia organisation, so I do radio, TV and online, and sort of thinking about how to tell those stories differently for different audiences. I went to the British Toy Fair, which is held in London. When was that? End of January, I think. Did a piece for one of the business programmes, which was all, multi-million-pound industry, and here are all the toys that are going to be big in the summer, blah, blah, blah. And then we ended up doing something for Newsround, which is children's TV news, which I've never done before. And it was basically like, look at this is really cool. And do you know what? It was harder for me to do that than it was to do the business stuff, because you have to get into such a completely different mindset, and it's just a style of reporting that you're not used to. So even though I've been doing this for a long time, there's always something new to learn, and that keeps your mind sharp, I think.
So how would you like your career to develop? Like, what is coming up for you where you kind of think this is kind of something new and exciting that I'd like to do?
Do you know, Sue, this is so hard. Loads of people have asked me this, like, what next? And honestly, I can't think of anything else I'd want to be doing right now. I really enjoy this job. I'm very lucky to work for a big organisation. We have a huge audience, which is great. We have a lot of editorial freedom to do what we think is the right thing for the audience.
And so if there was someone listening who thought, I like the sound of that, I want a piece of that.
Well, you can't, it's mine.
What advice would you give?
Well, journalism has changed so much. I kind of fell into it, and I was lucky, and the path that I came through I don't think exists anymore. But having said that, there are opportunities now that were not there for me. You've got a phone, you've got a camera, go out there and do some stuff and get it online and start building your own stories. You don't have to have an audience of millions, but it will train you to think. People don't really know how to tell stories, and there is an art, there is a knack to it. You've got to be succinct, you've got to be able to convey a sense of something in really very few words in very little time, and that takes practice. And I read the book Outliers recently by Malcolm Gladwell. Have you read it? It's a fantastic book, isn't it? And one of the things that he says in that is about successful people, and whether they are self-made by chance or whether they're actually, there's many more factors playing into it than pure opportunity, and of course he thinks there are. Anyway, he says, to get really good at anything, you have to do about 10,000 hours of practice. And that's how come, if you look at like the tech icons, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Bill Joy, all of those people, you know, they happen to be in institutions that had access to mainframe computers at a time when nobody did, and they liked them, so they were sitting up all night and, you know, bribing people to get in there and get on them and learn how to make them work and learn how to do the punch cards. And, you know, I think somebody said that in the early days of coding it was 99% proofreading, because if you got something wrong you had to start again. Anyway, so by the time computers became a thing, these guys had 10 years of practice. They'd done their 10,000 hours, and so bang, they were straight on it when everyone else was just waking up. And I think, you know, that's the same really with journalism. If you come here today and you've never done a report in your whole life, you're not going to manage it very well in one day. But if you've already been doing it, then it's not going to be such a shock.
Thank you so much for your time and for organising this beautifully soundproof studio, which is wonderful to pretend for a moment that I'm a BBC journalist.
Well, one day.
So thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for coming.
Thanks to Zoe for a fascinating look into life as a BBC tech reporter. You can find out more about Zoe on our website at findingada.com/podcast. And you can follow her on Twitter at ZSK. Our podcast is made possible thanks to the generous support of ARM, our exclusive semiconductor industry sponsor. You can find out more about ARM's energy-efficient microprocessor technology on their website at arm.com, and you can follow them on Twitter at ARM Holdings. Now it's time to turn our attention to an industry that's very much associated with men like Carl Benz, Gottlieb Daimler and Henry Ford, the automotive industry. It might surprise you to hear that many features we take for granted in modern cars were invented by women. Take the windscreen wiper. In the winter of 1902, a woman called Mary Anderson was riding in a New York City trolley car. The driver, she noticed, had to keep the front window open because he couldn't see through the sleet sliding down the glass. A year later, Anderson patented the first windscreen wiper. A spring-loaded arm moved a rubber blade back and forth across the glass and was controlled by a lever inside the vehicle. Anderson tried to sell the rights to her device, but the Canadian firm she approached said that it had no commercial value. Mechanical windscreen wipers, though, became common by 1913, though Anderson never made a penny from her invention. Another woman whose contribution to the automobile industry is often overlooked is Florence Lawrence, a Hollywood actress who starred in nearly 250 silent movies and was the first film star. In 1914, Lawrence developed a mechanical turn signalling arm for the rear bumper of her car. Operated by an electrical push button inside the car, it raised a little flag to signal which way the driver was about to turn. Lawrence also invented a brake signal that popped up a stop sign from the back bumper when the driver applied the brakes. Lawrence never patented either idea, and it would take another 40 years for turn signals to become widespread. Lawrence wasn't the only woman in her family with a passion for cars, though. Her mother, Charlotte Bridgewood, invented the automatic windscreen wiper after complaints that manual wipers were just too exhausting to use. Although Bridgewood did patent her design, she didn't commercialise it, and her idea wasn't picked up until after her patent expired in 1920. A few years later, Cadillac became the first car manufacturer to make the automatic windscreen wiper a standard feature. Then comes Margaret Wilcox, a mechanical engineer who, in 1893, designed and patented a car heater that would circulate hot water through pipes to warm up the passenger compartment. Rather than deriving its heat from the engine, Wilcox's heater had its own fuel and burner, and the water was pushed through the pipes by what she called a spiral water carrier, driven by the axle. It was a great improvement over the heater box, a metal box into which you could put a hot brick before your trip, not least in that it kept you warm for as long as the heater had fuel. There was no thermostat though, so it could get a little toasty. Now, I mentioned Carl Benz earlier, who in 1886 patented the Motorwagen, a three-wheeled car with a petrol engine. It was more like a powered trike with a bench seat and wire wheel than what we think of as a car, but it did the job. 2 years after that patent, Benz's wife, Bertha, took the motorwagen on the first long-distance automobile trip, driving 106 kilometres or 66 miles from Mannheim to Pforzheim to visit her mother. Experiencing a few problems on long downhill stretches, she got a cobbler to nail shoe leather to the brake blocks, thus inventing brake liners. She also suggested the addition of a new gear for climbing hills, having had to get out and push on more than one occasion. Her trip was also a marketing stunt. You could even call it the first test drive. It received a huge amount of publicity and prompted the first sales of the Benz patent motorwagen. So you see, women have been a part of the automotive industry literally since its inception, and our cars are safer and more pleasant to drive in thanks to them. I'd like to welcome to the podcast this month Dr. Paul Coxon, who is a physicist in the Department of Materials Science and Metallurgy at the University of Cambridge. Hi, Paul.
Hello.
So, Paul, who are you going to be telling us about this month?
I'm going to be talking about Constance Tipper. She was a metallurgist and she was a crystallographer. She was particularly interested in how the crystalline structure of metals influences the property of the metals. She was a scientist. She has an interesting life. She was born in 1894. Dad was a surgeon, and she went to school, a very nice school in Southwold in Suffolk. And this school was called the St. Felix School. It was founded by Margaret Gardner, and she had the idea that girls were treated as sensible beings. So she had a very thorough grounding in science from a very early age. So after school, she then came to Cambridge. She went to Newnham College, which was one of the women's colleges here. That was about 1912. Critically, it wasn't part of the university, so women were considered students, but they weren't actually undergraduates. When the women came into lectures with the men, they had to sit on their own in the front row with a chaperone. So she was taught by some of the big names of science of that time. She had her own set of laboratories in Newnham College. So during her studies, she worked on natural sciences, which is a little bit of everything. A lot of botany, anatomy, animal structures and skeletons. If you look through her old laboratory notebooks, they're filled with these amazing diagrams, beautifully coloured, hand-drawn. They look very detailed, that you can imagine were computer drawn today. She was really quite a skillful artist. So while she was at Cambridge, she took one of the exams, the Tripos exam, and she gained a third class in that, which was quite an achievement. Not many women took the natural sciences exams in Cambridge. They were thought to be rather too complicated for women. After she was at Cambridge, she then went to work in the National Physical Laboratory just outside of London, but then she quickly moved from there to the Royal School of Mines in Kensington, which is now part of Imperial College. While she was there, she was started to work as a research assistant to Harold Carpenter, and her work was good enough that she was awarded several fellowships. And what she was working on was how you can make large pieces of metal into single crystals. Where she was interested in how the crystalline structure affected the properties of metal. And she became quite skilled at that. In fact, she developed techniques to make large crystals of aluminium, which was an interesting metal at the time. She was so good at making crystals, she actually sent samples of her crystals to William Bragg, the very famous crystallographer, for him to study when he was at the Royal Institution. And so he was a real pioneer in the experimental study of metallurgy, understanding the atomic arrangements in the metals and how it influences the metal's properties, such as things like strength and durability.
So were there many other women involved in that area at that time?
No, there were none at all. She was the first. Pretty much the first anyway, but she was certainly the one who managed to achieve so much recognition at such an early age. So in the 1920s and 1930s, metallurgy, the understanding of metals, was undergoing a large renaissance. We had new techniques using X-rays to understand the structure of materials, and how the crystalline structure, specifically the microstructure, influences how a material behaves under certain conditions. She worked with a guy called Geoffrey Taylor, who was one of the great luminaries of metallurgy, and they published several papers together. Her reputation was so high that Geoffrey and Constance were invited to give a lecture with the Royal Society in London. It was on the distortion of an aluminium crystal during a tensile test. Now, in those days, when you published a paper, the author names were just given as your initials and your surname. So these papers that Constance wrote, she was listed as C.F. Elam. And so the Royal Society didn't know whether it was a man or a woman. They assumed, obviously, working in metallurgy, it couldn't possibly be a woman. And so she was invited to give this lecture with Geoffrey Taylor. But then they realised, the Royal Society, that she was a woman. Women weren't allowed to join the society, and they weren't allowed to take part in the lectures or the dinner afterwards. So it caused a bit of a problem for the Royal Society. Luckily, Constance was rather diplomatic. There's a lovely little letter in the Newnham Archives which says that she gives her apologies to the Royal Society, that she has the misfortune of not being born a man, and so rather by way of consolation they gave her a box of chocolates instead.
Ooh, that almost hurts.
It did. So Geoffrey Taylor gave the lecture instead. This was in 1923. 50 years later, Constance and Geoffrey were invited to the 50th anniversary of this lecture. By this time, women were allowed to join the society and their dining club. Geoffrey couldn't go, Constance went instead. So she got to the 50th anniversary of the lecture, which she never got to give.
Well, I guess better late than never. So where did her research lead her after that?
Well, she was working on the properties of single crystals, large crystals of material. So crystals have got lots of atoms all in regular periodic structure. And she was working on how materials can change shape, how they can deform. So she was looking at aluminium, plastically deformed aluminium. So when something deforms plastically, that means you can exert a force on the material and it doesn't return back to its original shape. If something returns back to its original shape, it's elastic deformation. But when you've gone too far and it can't return back completely, that's plastic deformation. And she was looking at the underlying mechanics of the crystal structure, how the slip planes and the slip directions influence the plastic deformation. This was real fundamental, basic research into materials and how we understand these rules by which the planes glide and move over each other. They often have little names after them. One of the rules is called Deal's rule. It should probably be called Elam's rule after Constance, because she did a lot of the early groundwork on this. So back in the 1920s and 30s, she was laying the foundation for understanding the plastic behaviour of crystals. And this underpinned what we understand as the theory of dislocations. So when you have a crystal, nicely ordered structure, a dislocation is a defect in the crystal. The defects, you have some planes of atoms out of place where they should be expected to be. So he was laying the theory of dislocations and how they move and how this influences the large-scale structure. Constance was doing the early groundwork, which led to this very much important, critical part of material science, how dislocations move.
So that's really fundamental work then, fundamental to the field?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It opened a whole new field. So plastic behaviour of crystals was one of the founding disciplines of material science. So she really was at the very much the top of her field. If you go back to her life, she was working with these guys, going between Cambridge and London, research fellow, the Royal School of Mines. Although she never got a degree when she was a student at Cambridge, she was awarded one from London. She was a Doctor of Science, one of the highest degrees you can get. So after she left the Royal School of Mines, she came back to Cambridge to work as a research fellow at Newnham College on the plastic crystalline behaviour of metals. This is because the Cavendish laboratory here had some of the best X-ray crystallography facilities to let you look at the crystalline structure of materials as they were plastically deforming. She wrote a book as well, a classic of the literature. What else could it be called but The Distortion of Metal Crystals? And it was pretty much a pioneering treatment of how metals behave. And if you look around, wherever you are, you see lots and lots of things made out of metal, and how they behave when they're under certain stress or certain conditions is very important to how we can use these metals. So in the late 1930s, she was appointed a lecturer in metallurgy, which was part of the Department of Chemistry. So in the late 1930s, when World War II started, lots of male staff members at Cambridge were seconded to different parts of the government for war work. Some went off into military service. So there was a great absence of people to teach the students who were coming through. So in 1939, Constance was made a lecturer in the Department of Engineering here, and she took on essentially the bulk of the laboratory teaching. Didn't really suit her very well. She was more suited to research. She managed to do a great job of it, and she took over the heat treatment laboratory, which was quite a task. So this was an interesting difference between Britain and Germany during the war. So during the war, Britain, especially, lots of women were recruited into various tasks as part of the war effort. Didn't happen so much in Germany. And in Cambridge, we had lots of highly trained women who'd had experience of higher education who were put into quite highly technical roles. So as well as Constance, who was doing most of the teaching in engineering, you had Dorothy Garrod, who was the first woman to be a professor at either Oxford or Cambridge. She was an archaeologist, and she was bringing her highly trained skills to help the RAF interpret aerial photographs. We also had another Newnham student, Violet Kane. She was a statistician. She worked alongside Alan Turing at Bletchley. So during the war was when she was really taken from this rather sheltered research career, and her role expanded within the university. But what really made her name was her work on the Liberty ships. The Liberty ships, they were cargo ships. They were designed to carry cargo and troops from the US to England without needing to refuel. They actually carried about 3/4 of all of the cargo used by the US during World War II. These were the ships on which Britain depended for its survival. And they were designed for emergency construction. They were a fairly simple design. They were actually based on an old-fashioned British steamer. They were quite ugly and boxy, but they could hold 10,000 tons, and they were pretty quick to build. I think Time magazine called them the ugly ducklings. But they built thousands of them. They built about 2,700 of these ships. They're the greatest number of ships ever to be built in one class, ever. And their design remit was given very simply: build them quicker than they can be sunk. So at the time, the German U-boats were sinking the supply ships, the merchant ships, which are bringing food and supplies which we depended on. So in order to beat this threat, they said, right, we're going to build ships incredibly quickly to keep Europe supplied. And these were the Liberty ships. But what was interesting about them was, in order to build them quickly, instead of using riveted plates, they welded the plates together. There was a guy called Henry Kaiser who was the head of this program. He was a patriot in pinstripes, they called him. He'd never built a ship before. He was an industrial contractor, was involved in building the Hoover Dam. He was involved very, very majorly in the shipyards, in building all of these ships. So between 1941 to 45, about 2,700 of these ships were built. They were mass-produced, rather like Henry Ford and his Model T car. So you had all of these parts being fabricated in factories around the US. They were transported to the shipyards at the coasts. and they were built very quickly, and they managed to get a standardized design of about 250,000 parts welded together in about 100 days. That was very quick. There were something like 1.5 million men and women who were involved in building these Liberty ships. We all might have seen the familiar image of Rosie the Riveter, the symbol of wartime women in work. But really, that should be Wendy the Welder, because these women were welding huge ships, mass producing them constantly, day and night. In fact, they eventually got the average time down to about 40 days to make a ship from nothing to launch. In fact, the very quickest they did it was in 4 days, working 24/7. It was really much a construction miracle. So they were building all of these ships. They found that as these ships were going into service across the North Atlantic, about 400 of them started to fracture. And of these 400, about 90 of them were quite serious fractures. And about 6 of them failed completely. Literally, the ships cracked in half. Imagine snapping a twig. One of them snapped in half while it was in the harbour. And this was a real problem. Although they were cargo ships, they did carry about 40 crew and a few military guards, and lives were lost. The original thought was that it was the welding. It was a new technique, a relatively new technique in shipbuilding. It's the welding. And so there was a committee set up by the Admiralty in the UK and also the US Navy, and they were looking at what is going on with these ships. The problem was put to Sir John Baker, the head of engineering department at Cambridge, and he said, if you want to know anything about metal, I've got just the woman, Constance Tipper. So he gave the challenge to her, and she was looking at particularly the metallurgy of the steel used in these ships. So what was happening was, as the ship was going up and down in the sea, it was bending. The deck was being stressed, pulled apart, and then compressed. And they found that these ships were cracking in particular places, usually a hatch near the back, a sharp, square-cornered hatch where there was a weld joining one of the seams. What was happening at the corner of the hatch, you had what's called stress concentrator, so that the stress was being concentrated very much at these corners, and where there was a weld alongside, you had tiny, tiny cracks within the weld, and these cracks started to grow. Now, when you've welded together a set of steel plates, you've essentially made the ship out of one complete piece of metal. So there's nothing to stop a crack propagating throughout the whole ship. When a crack develops, it can travel very quickly, and that can lead to a ship literally splitting in two. So Constance was looking at how the material was behaving under different temperatures. So imagine if you have a piece of toffee, a normal stick of toffee, at room temperature, and you give it a strain, you pull it apart, and it'll gradually get thinner and thinner and thinner in the middle. It's called necking. It gets thinner and thinner and thinner. If you keep pulling it, the thin little strand gets so thin, and then it eventually breaks. This is called ductile fracture. And this is what was expected to happen in the steel when they were in the North Atlantic, used in the Liberty ships. But what was happening is that the steel was breaking quickly. So imagine you have a very cold piece of toffee, taken it out of the freezer, and you pull it apart and it snaps very quickly. It's brittle. Constance was looking at how the temperature of the steel was affecting the properties. So Constance wanted to get to the bottom of the problem, and she devised what is now known as the Tipper test. So you take a plate of the steel and you cut a notch in it, and you make an impact against the steel, and you measure how much energy it takes to knock the steel and cause it to break. And she worked out that the steel which was being used for these Liberty ships was becoming brittle at much higher temperatures than was expected. In fact, at room temperature. So that they were expecting the steel which was going into these ships to be a bit stretchy. If you could pull it, it's okay, it's not going to crack. But when it was cooled down into the the temperatures of the North Atlantic, it was being very, very brittle. That means when it had a stress applied on it, and it just broke completely. And she was one of the people who really understood the fundamentals of how the metal was behaving. So they got lots of samples from all over the world from failed ships, and they came to Cambridge, and she was testing them. They couldn't change the quality of the steel used in these ships, but they managed to put some stopgap measures to stop the stress concentrators at this particular hatch, which was causing the cracks. But it really improved ship design. So most of the ships in the world today are welded, and most of them don't crack. And we have to thank Constance Tipper a lot for that work which she did then.
So Constance Tipper really was an important figure, not just in material science and metallurgy, but also in the war effort. I think she's someone we should all know about.
Yeah, she wrote up her story in a book after the war. It's called The Brittle Fracture Story, and it is still very much a classic of the discipline. It's very readable, and it helped open up this whole new discipline called fracture mechanics, which is how we understand how materials break. And if we can understand how materials break, we can understand how to make materials safer. Every time you go in an aeroplane and you look at the rounded window, thank Constance Tipper.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for telling us about Constance Tipper and her contributions to metallurgy and safety. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Great now, thanks.
Thanks to Paul for giving us such a fascinating insight into Constance Tipper. You can find out more about both Constance and Paul on our website, and you can follow Paul on Twitter @Paul Coxon. Thanks again to our sponsor, ARM, for their ongoing support, and thanks also to our editor, Andrew Marks. Don't forget that you can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Google Play and Stitcher. And if you like what you hear, please rate, review and share our podcast with your friends. So thanks for listening, and we look forward as much as you do to finding out who we're going to talk to next month.